Inspiring interviews with today's top landlords. This is the Rental Income Podcast. And now, Dan Lane.
My guest on the podcast today has a great story. He built a rental portfolio that was very highly leveraged. He had a lot of debt on his rental properties, and they just weren't making him much money. Every month, the rent payments would come in. He would pay the mortgage. He would pay any expenses. But there just wasn't any cash flow there after everything was paid. So what he figured out he could do was sell off some of his properties and then use the equity in those properties to pay off or pay down other mortgages. And what ended up happening is he ended up with a much smaller portfolio that's actually making him way more money. So on the show today, we're going to walk through exactly how he did this. Joining us on the show today from Kansas City is Mike Bryant. We'll take a really quick break. We'll thank our sponsors. We'll come right back and we'll meet Mike. Being a landlord just became a lot easier thanks to Tenant Cloud. They have everything you need to manage your rental properties all in one place, from taking online applications to creating custom leases specific to your state and collecting rent online. And this is really cool. They actually have local contractors in your area to help you when you have a repair call. That's right, contractors in your area that are there for you when you need them. Everything is right there, all in one place. How much does it cost? Well, this is crazy. It's totally free to sign up. It's not a trial. It's free forever. They do have some paid plans, but it's totally free to sign up and get started. Just go to tenantcloud.com. That's Tenant Cloud, C-L-O-U-D, tenantcloud.com. The first step in buying a rental property is to get pre-qualified, and I would suggest you work with a lender that specializes in working with investors, because the last thing you want to have happen is to get to closing and find out the money's not there and you can't close. The lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge from Ridge Lending Group. She's a nationwide lender, and she'll pre-qualify you for free if you mention Rental Income Podcast. Find out more today. Contact Chaley at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's R-I-D-G-E, lendinggroup.com. NMLS 42056. Mike, so you're in the process of basically slimming down your portfolio. Tell me what your portfolio looked like before you started selling off some of your properties.
I bought 14 different rental properties, mostly single family homes. And we paid this, we solved a problem for the seller. We acquired a good property. Some of them needed a little bit of rehab. None of them were like huge projects. But they were either rent ready or pretty close to rent ready, or in some cases they had tenants in place. And we bought them from what I would call a retiring landlord.
So you had a lot of leverage at first. You didn't have any money to put into the properties. And now you're going to a lower leveraged portfolio. Is that just to reduce your risk? Is that why you want to have too much, or you want to have less leverage? Do you feel like you were maybe over leveraged?
Well, first of all, the paying down the debt really improves the cash flow, for one thing, of the properties. Mm-hmm. So early on, we structured these deals where they weren't necessarily great cash flowing properties. I mean, they were good, solid homes that I knew over a 9 or 12 or 15 year period were in good areas where the values are likely to hold up pretty well, if not appreciate. But the cash flow right out of the gate, putting one of these deals together, typically after you allowed for, some operating reserves and some repairs and maintenance, and it wouldn't just, be a negative cash flow every month, but it's, you're not making lifestyle income on your cash flow up front because you've got a lot of debt on the property.
The strategy was to buy properties without using any of your money, and then to work on getting the properties paid off. And that's really kind of the end goal, is you want to have a portfolio of paid off rentals.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I look at retiring and not, going out there and, either earning money at a job or, making commission checks as a realtor and doing transactions that way, you want to have that portfolio of rental property that is delivering income monthly.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're free and clear, that's great. You have taxes, you have insurance, maintenance, maybe some management if you don't want to do the management yourself. But and even if there's some debt on them, they can cash flow pretty good as long as you're reducing the debt. And I always look at the debt as, is it friendly or unfriendly? Like a private loan that's at 8% interest only, it's okay. When I needed to acquire, when I needed that loan to acquire the property or to fund the deal, then okay, I can live with those interest only payments, and I work them into the calculations. But eventually, you don't want those; they don't pay down. You're just forking over interest money to an investor that is enjoying earning interest on his money. And I want to keep the investor happy, but at the same time, that's not great debt to have on a property for any long period of time.
So the strategy was to buy properties that are going to stand on their own, that the rent's going to come in, you're going to be able to service your mortgage debt, pay for any repairs and vacancy. And if all goes well, you're breaking even. But where the real money is going to come in is down the road when these properties are paid off.
Well, what I'm really banking on is the debt over time. The tenants basically pay the mortgage down. And when you have seller finance debt that's at super low interest, lots of principal being paid down, that is underneath the cash flow cap of what the rent is bringing in, then you just put your nose to the grindstone, and the next thing you know, 3 or 4 years go by and you start looking at what you owe the seller, and the rents maybe are going up, I don't know, 10 or 15 bucks a month every year, or however you manage it. And the next thing you know, you've got a higher cash flow spread, and you've built up some equity, even if the market appreciation really isn't there. But as it's turned out, as you and I and your listeners all know, the market appreciation has been phenomenal the last 4 or 5 years. Even if we didn't get the great market appreciation, I would have some decent equity built up from just pay down of these notes.
Right. So let's talk about how you did this. So you were buying these properties with no money out of your pocket. So walk me through how this would work.
But we would have these retiring landlords was kind of our target. We would send postcards to non-owner occupied properties, and we're looking for somebody that owns a property they don't live in, and maybe they're ready to part with it. And found definitely some motivated sellers that either had a landlord problem. They either had a problem property, they didn't want to be a landlord, or they were just getting too old and they liked the idea of the stream of income, but they didn't like the idea of the property management. And plenty of those people out there we found. You're talking their language. I can give you close to market value, if not more than market value, if you're willing to take your payments over time. And then you start the dialogue. And again, we had a spreadsheet that got developed over time that's a very robust spreadsheet that allowed us to plug in, okay, what's our rent? What's our taxes and insurance? What's our vacancy rate? How much can this property afford? And then the longer the seller's willing to go on his note, the more money that we can put on the price, because it's a time value of money thing.
That's interesting. So you're not, you were never looking to get a steal on a property. You were paying the market value, but the value to you was that the seller was going to finance it to you, so you didn't have to get a bank loan.
Right. But I would have people ask me, and my wife was great at asking me, she's like, why would a seller do that?
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, I'm solving a problem for them. And price ends up being a very important thing for a lot of these sellers. That, they feel like their house is worth $100,000, just to use round numbers. And then they had the We Buy Houses people and all the people that are sending them yellow letters and postcards and saying, we want to buy your house, blah, blah, and they're all coming in and they're offering them 60. And they're offended by it. Hey, my house is worth 100. Then I would go in and I would say, look, if you want all your cash today, then yeah, 60 is probably about what I could do. But I can pay you 100. However, if you'll wait for your money, this is how I can afford to pay you your 100. And I mean, people understand that, but sometimes when you get into dialogue with someone, then, it starts to make sense for them. It's like they still have to trust that I'm not going to default.
And these are investors, so they're used to getting the monthly cash flow. So the idea of instead of the tenant paying rent and getting cash flow that way, they're going to be getting a mortgage payment from you, but they're used to and they like the idea of a monthly income. Is that
Right.
basically how it worked?
Yeah, and what it really is a lot of real estate investors, they're still being taught that, okay, how do you get into the real estate game if you don't have a bunch of money to put in, or you don't have the ability to borrow money at a bank? Well, what do? You go out, you wholesale. So you're looking for that deal and you're trying to get that deal under contract cheaper than what someone you can flip the contract to. Well, that's got to be a tough way to go. I've never done wholesaling, but it's like you really, I'm sure people are successful at it, but you still got to be able to find that person, that seller that's willing to basically unload their problem on somebody to solve. You're still solving a problem.
Right.
Or you're going to have to do something else. Well, cash, or you're a cash buyer and you're going to use the old 70% of ARB, less repairs, or whatever your formula is. You're going to use one of those formulas to calculate a low offer for someone who has a problem. And that works, and people do it every day. What this strategy did was offer an alternative to that when I had sellers that didn't like the idea, because I would also lay a cash offer and I'm like, hey, I'm an investor and there's multiple ways that we can skin this cat, Mr. Seller. I can give you this cash offer. And actually I had some people take cash offers, and we still did it with private notes. But that's another story for another day. But usually people were very open to the idea of getting a higher sales price and taking their money over time, because it met the need that they had at the time. And I was surprised at how many people did it, but obviously I was rejected a lot on that idea from.
Yeah, it's a numbers game, right?
It's a numbers game, right? But I was able to, out of, with not putting a nickel into any of these, that I have a portfolio that between what I've sold already this past year and what I haven't sold yet, of more than $500,000 of equity, at least on paper, from what I can glean is the market value versus what I owe on these properties. So
it's incredible.
I wouldn't have expected that to have happened, but of course, you've got 9 years of rental income and 9 years of note pay downs on very friendly financing in most cases. So,
well, let's walk through one of your deals to illustrate how this works. So tell me about one of your properties.
Really decent property, nice property over in Raytown. And I ran the numbers. So we ended up, and it needed some rehab. So it had like the original 1957 kitchen in it. The house had been beat up by a tenant. It was vacant. And the seller was kind of at his wit's end. He may have gotten some cash offers. I don't really know. But anyway, the house appraised for about 85 when I bought it, because I always paid to have an appraisal done. But I was able to buy it for $68,600 with basically no money down and a seller note for $68,500. I gave him $100 earnest money deposit, which amazed me.
Yeah.
We had a private lender fund a $25,000 first lien. That's what we used to remodel the kitchen. We basically tore the kitchen out of there, had a contractor come in. We spent like $18,000 on redoing the floors, interior paint, and a kitchen remodel, and I think kind of a light bath remodel, as I recall. And nothing fancy, rental quality stuff, but new cabinets, etc. And the rent, as I recall, the first renter I put in there paid me $850 a month. We ended up holding this property for 9 years, and I sold it this past summer, 2020. We had to put another $15,000 into it, but before we sold it, because I had 9 years of rentals on it, and so it was in a little bit rough shape when I got it at my last vacancy. So it needed another interior paint job. It needed the floors redone again, and just some cleanup and things like that. So we did put some more money into it, but we sold it for $157,000.
Okay, so you bought the property for $68,600,
Right?
And then
right.
you spent $25,000 fixing it up. So
right, but a lender put that 20. Right. So I was in debt on the property, the $25,000 plus the seller note at $68,500.
Okay, so you're all in. That's $93,000 for the 68 and 25.
Correct.
And so you're renting it for $850 a month.
Right.
Okay. Now
I'm paying about little over $700 between taxes, insurance, my private lender note, and the seller note.
Okay. All right. So after you get the rent, you pay $700 for. That's for your mortgage notes to your private investor and your seller, and then also taxes and insurance.
Correct.
Okay, so you're all in at $700. So you've got $150 a month, and you mentioned that you were kind of putting that money aside, that $150 for repairs and vacancy and everything else.
Right. So that's
pretty
what
good.
The numbers look like there. Yeah. But then when we cashed out of it, I owed the seller, because the note was so friendly with the seller, at $300 a month, and I held it for not quite 9 years, almost 9 years. So that's however many months where I paid him $300. So I owed him, it was like $20-some thousand, $25,000 or whatever was what was still owed on the note. The private lender had to be paid off as well. Mm-hmm. So between the seller note and the private lender note of $25,000, I owed a total of like $48,000 at closing of liens that had to be paid off at closing. And our purchase price was $157, or our sale price was $157, not our purchase. Okay. So we sold it for $157. So I walked out of that closing after paying the private note off and paying the seller off in full on our original agreement. I walked out of there with about $100,000.
That's a home run. That's awesome. Now, tell me, when you were actually operating the property for those 9 years, so you've got $150 to pay for whatever expenses or vacancy you're going to have. Did you ever go negative? Like, did that $150 that you were putting aside, did that carry the property, or did you ever have to kick in extra money?
Well, the thing to remember is when we took this $25,000 private note, that money basically went into my bank account when I purchased the property. And then we paid for the rehab, but we only spent about $18,000 on the rehab. So I always like to calculate getting enough from the private lender on the deal to more than pay for whatever I project the home needs right when I buy it. So a lot of the homes I bought didn't really need very much of anything, and some of them were tenant occupied, but we would still take a private lender note, which gives us a kind of seed money to handle if I had to replace the water heater right away, or had to have a big major improvement type of a thing that I didn't anticipate. I would have some money to fall back on. So there may have been some months, and I had, I think, 3 different tenants in the 9 years, maybe 4. So there would be some vacancy along the way, a couple of months while you go in and, spruce it up and get ready for the next renter. But so yeah, those would be negative cash flow months when you're vacant. But I always wanted to have some money come in. And this was my first deal, so it gave me a little pad in my bank account that as I did deal number 2 and deal number 3 and deal number 4, and always getting enough private lender money at the front end to always take a little bit of profit at the front end to give you money in your bank account, so that you're not like, taking your child's grocery money to try to pay a note that you're not going to default on. Right. I always had a lot of comfort that I had money in the bank, that it was borrowed money. Mm-hmm. I mean, it was 10% interest only borrowed money. So it's not the best financing in the world, but what's the old adage? It's like the availability of capital, the leverage. It's not my money. It is money I'm paying an investor back on. And as long as the property is rented and my renters are paying rent, which they largely do, then everything's paid for. And if I do have a month or two here or there that I'm coming out of pocket to do something, I've got money in the account because every property started with at least $5,000 of private lender money that was available to me to just sit kind of in an operating reserve, if you will.
Right. Okay.
And be there. Yep.
So the investors were paying for the rehab, and then they were also paying for your emergency fund. And then you also had rent money that you were adding to that, whatever your cash flow was, you were adding that to your emergency fund so that everything was covered, and you weren't trying to necessarily make a profit because that your payoff was going to come down the road when you sold these properties.
Right.
Now, did you ever feel that you were too leveraged? Did it ever feel risky? Because you did have, very, very high payments that you were making to your investor and to your seller. Did you ever feel like, or looking back on it, do you ever feel like maybe you were too leveraged?
I never felt like I was necessarily too leveraged, although, clearly right out of the gate, I owed more on the properties than the properties were worth, like at the very beginning. Like if I did a deal like this and then 6 months later, I would have to bail out of it and sell the property for some reason and pay everybody off at exactly what I owed them. You wouldn't make money in that deal.
Right.
But that was never it was always a long-term buy and hold strategy. So, this isn't it's not a flip strategy. It's not a get in, get out. It is we're going to build a rental portfolio that we're going to hold. And like this first deal I did was a 12-year seller note. So I knew when I signed this deal in 2011, it's like, well, the worst case scenario for me is going to be I owe the seller $20-some thousand at the end of the term. Plus I'm going to owe my private lender. If I don't get it paid off earlier, I'm going to owe him $25,000 because it's interest only. So I'm going to owe $49,000 on this house, this 3-bedroom, 2-bath, 1,000 square foot ranch in Raytown, Missouri. In 2023, I'm going to owe $49,000 on that house. Do I feel risky? No, that didn't really intimidate me. I'm like, you never know what the future is going to bring, but 12 years down the road, I don't think if I'm in control of this property fully, I didn't think that I would be in a problem situation if I owed $49,000.
Right.
And if I didn't have another plan, I would sell the property in 2023 or 6 months ahead of that so that I could make sure everybody got paid off on time. And I would take whatever profit I had, knowing that virtually every month that house was rented, I was making a little bit of cash flow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and
it's supporting the debt.
Mike definitely had some very thin deals. He had a lot of leverage. He had a lot of risk, but you got to hand it to him. He really pulled off something pretty amazing that 9 years ago he had no money, and today he's got a rental portfolio that is almost paid off. I think that's really inspiring. Congratulations, Mike. If anybody is in the Kansas City area and you're looking for a realtor, or if you want to invest in Kansas City, Mike is a full-time agent and he would be happy to connect with you. I've got his contact information on the website. You can find it at rentalincomepodcast.com/episode 309. I'd like to thank today's sponsors for making this episode possible. I'd like to thank Tenant Cloud. If you're looking for online leases, online applications, if you want to set up online ACH payments for your tenants, you can do it all at tenantcloud.com. It's free to get started. They do have some paid plans, but you can check it out for free. Just go to Tenant Cloud, CLOUD, tenantcloud.com. I'd also like to thank Ridge Lending Group for sponsoring today's episode. If you're looking to buy a rental property, whether you're just getting started or you want to add to your portfolio, the lender that I recommend is Chaley Ridge. She's a nationwide lender and she specializes in working with investors. If you want to find out more or you're ready to get started, just go to ridgelendinggroup.com. That's RIDGE. lendinggroup.com. If you mention Rental Income Podcast, they will waive all the pre-qualification fees. NMLS 42056. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast today. Make sure you subscribe. We have new interviews every single Tuesday. And if you subscribe, you'll get notified as soon as they come out. My name is Dan Lane, and this has been the Rental Income Podcast.